Molt bona tarda, molt benvingudes i benvinguts al Palau Macaya de la Fundació La Caixa. Com ja sabeu, som un centre UNESCO per les Ciències Socials i Humanitats. I avui estem contents perquè avui comencem o estrenem la primera activitat de les entitats que ja fa uns mesos enrere es van presentar una convocatòria de projectes de reflexió que organitzem des d'aquí del Palau Macaya. Un dels projectes que va ser escollit dels 11 és el d'EDAI i avui comencem. Per tant, a partir d'ara, segurament aquest dijous n'hi ha un altre d'una altra entitat i a partir d'ara i fins al juny cada mes tindrem diferents projectes de diferents temàtiques que responen a aquesta convocatòria de projectes de reflexió que organitzem des del Macaya. Per tant, felicitats, EDAI, felicitats, Leticia, i a les diferents persones de la vostra entitat, que igual algunes esteu aquí, jo no us conec a tots i a totes, conec amb ella, perquè heu estat seleccionats entre 98 projectes, amb la qual jo crec que us podeu sentir contents i contentes. Avui comença aquest projecte que, com diu el títol del cicle, és Construïm ponts entre ments i perspectives diverses, i en concret amb el diàleg que tot just de les meves paraules s'encetarà, titulat Comprendre les nostres diferències, diàlegs sobre l'empatia i la neurodiversitat. I com ens deien quan es van presentar en la nostra convocatòria des d'EDAI, el que volen és un espai per escoltar, per dialogar i per crear des de la diferència. Jo, abans de continuar, deixeu-me fer una salutació especial als ponents d'avui, a la senyora Agnes Callard, no sé si ho pronuncio bé, al senyor Damian Milton i a la, com deia abans, a la Leticia Asenjo, que farà de moderadora i, a més, és la directora d'EDAI. Ells el que volen fer és promoure el diàleg entre persones neurodivergents i normatives per afavorir la comprensió mútua i la convivència. És a dir, jo crec que és interessant, i volen repensar conceptes com l'empatia, que d'avui ens en parlaran, i al final volen generar materials també audiovisuals i escrits que afavoreixen aquesta sensibilització social i transformació d'alguns dels serveis educatius, sanitaris i socials. És a dir, la convocatòria de projectes de reflexió és una convocatòria propositiva, i per tant nosaltres els demanem a les diferents entitats que s'hi presenten, com és el cas d'EDAI, que no només ens expliquin sobre quin repte o sobre quina problemàtica o sobre quina idea volen reflexionar, perquè això funciona a base de la reflexió. Nosaltres no ens dediquem a fer acció, això ho fan altres companys i altres àrees de la Fundació La Caixa, com bé sabeu, sinó que des de la reflexió arribar a conclusions, per això diem que és un projecte o són projectes propositius. Al final de les activitats, que suposo que la Leticia en algun moment ens ho explicarà, perquè jo no trepitjar-li, perquè això us toca a vosaltres, d'aquí uns mesos ens explicaran a quines propostes, a quines conclusions, després de, no només de l'activitat d'avui, sinó que 3 seminaris que hi haurà i una activitat final, l'entitat sobre el repte que tenia, que és justament aprofundint aquest concepte de la neurodiversitat i repensar des d'una mirada crítica i plural què vol dir inclusió, normalitat i convivència. És a dir, no sé, ens semblava, i en el jurat li va semblar, i que us quedi clar que el director d'aquest centre no forma part del jurat, amb la qual cosa em sento molt lliure de poder explicar això que us estic dient. Crec que, com deia, que és estimulatiu que algunes institucions, en aquest cas una entitat com EDAI, ens pugui proposar a la societat barcelonina, catalana, si voleu espanyola, com repensar i com tractar tot el tema de la neurodiversitat, com es pot repensar. Justament es tracta d'això, a partir de la reflexió, poder arribar a conclusions. Per part meva, res més. Jo només dir-vos que n'estic segur que abans que un cop hi hagin aquestes conclusions, però fixeu-vos, abans d'arribar a conclusions cal primer reflexionar. I voldria acabar amb una frase que nosaltres diem molt aquí en el Palau Macaya, i de fet crec que si algú ha vingut altres vegades me l'heu escoltat, que sempre diem que el primer pas per avançar és reflexionar. Per tant, jo crec que avui segur que ho heu fet moltes altres vegades, per tant ho practiqueu una vegada més, Per part meva us desitjo molt bones reflexions i ens anirem veient a partir d'aquests mesos aquí al Macaya.
Perfecte, moltes gràcies.
Bona tarda.
Doncs moltes gràcies a la Fundació La Caixa i al Palau Macaya. Com ara comentàvem, estem molt contents perquè hem guanyat aquesta convocatòria de reflexions que ha convocat el Palau Macaya. Nosaltres som EDAI, pels que no ens coneixeu, som una entitat multidisciplinària, treballem amb infants i adolescents i amb famílies neurodiversos, vull dir que amb condicions del neurodesenvolupament o risc de tenir condicions del neurodesenvolupament. Treballem des de fa gairebé 20 anys, de fet l'any que ve és el nostre aniversari i de fet també ens feia com una especial il·lusió poder començar una mica les festivitats d'aniversari amb aquest cicle, ara ja que encetem gairebé aquest nou any. Avui comencem, és l'acte inaugural del cicle. No estic mirant el mòbil, és que aquí tinc la meva xuleta, que m'he deixat el full amb els nervis a la motxilla i ho vaig mirant aquí. La idea de la que volem partir realment és senzilla, però de vegades, com totes les idees senzilles, de vegades no és tan fàcil realment de realitzar. I és que volem pensar i reflexionar entre tots junts com les diferències entre ments i perspectives diverses, que és com hem titulat el cicle, podem conviure i que la diferència realment no es penalitzi ni sigui objecte de rebuig o d'estranyesa en la societat i en la convivència. Pensem que realment la diferència és font de creativitat i és una font d'aprenentatge i hem d'aprendre tots junts com realment creure'ns-ho, realment per poder practicar-ho. Un dels objectius del cicle serà això, com ara comentàvem, el poder repensar aquests conceptes que donem per sentat, com és el concepte de normalitat. Al final, les persones que tenen el poder són les persones que proposen les normes o les lleis d'una societat i a partir d'aquí pensem que és normal allò que ens han dit que és normal. Llavors, un dels objectius per poder pensar tots junts és realment, tenen sentit algunes d'aquestes categories que ara mateix hi ha algunes persones que donen molt per sentades. Un és la normalitat, l'altre és l'empatia, la convivència, tot això és el que intentarem reflexionar tots junts. I avui comencem aquest primer acte, aquesta conferència. Estem molt contents perquè hem convidat tant a l'Agnes Callard, ella és escriptora i és filòsofa de la Universitat de Chicago. Us recomano molt el seu últim llibre, que és Open Sócrates. En castellà està traduït per Cairós, com Sócrates al descubierto, i crec que aviat el tindrem també en català, tot i que no sé ben bé quan, però jo crec que aviat la traducció també la tindrem. Ella ens ajudarà a pensar de manera, ja veureu, és una font inesgotable d'idees i d'una manera molt, molt lúcida a qüestionar totes aquestes categories que donem per òbvies. I també tenim el Damian Milton, ell és sociòleg i és investigador de la Universitat de Kent. Ell és l'ideòleg del concepte de la doble empatia, que ara ens explicarà què és. I jo crec que ha revolucionat la comprensió de les relacions entre neurotips diferents. Les seves intervencions tindran com dues parts complementàries. Començarà el doctor Milton i ens farà una introducció al concepte de la doble empatia, les seves implicacions també per l'educació, per la salut i per les polítiques d'inclusió. I després l'Agnes ens oferirà una mirada filosòfica que qüestionarà. Ella ens ha dit 9 pàgines de preguntes pel Damian, no sé si tindrem temps a tot, i després obrirem una estona de preguntes pel públic, que segur que sortiran moltes reflexions interessants. I sense més, doncs, dono la paraula al doctor Milton. Moltes gràcies per ser aquí.
I think I'll stand up if you don't mind. Need to see my slides. So I'll just move here. Okay. And so I'm going to be discussing this concept of the double empathy problem that I coined many years ago now. To give a bit of context, I'm autistic myself. I was diagnosed in 2009, and this was following my son's diagnosis in 2005. My son was diagnosed at the age of 2, so very early on. My son is now 23, and just take that out my ear. And I was diagnosed at the age of 36, so quite late on. I now have 2 7-year-old non-identical twin daughters, and one of them has been diagnosed as autistic as well. My background's in social science, initially sociology, but I've branched out into psychology and education and disability studies, so quite broad. And I work at the University of Kent, but also in various other capacities, but all regarding autism. So I'm going to start with this quote from Hans Asperger. And this quote I use because it's something I quite strongly disagree with and what it's kind of aiming towards as an idea. The autist is only himself and is not an active member of a greater organism which he is influenced by and which he influences constantly. Kind of what Asperger was getting at here was that autistic people were not really being seen as full members of society, as being fully socialized into social norms and values, or having a major influence on social life in return. And I think these kind of early ideas of autistic people being unsocializable in an empty shell cut off from society has done quite a lot of damage in terms of how autistic people have been seen over time. And these quotes here all came from a project I was involved with in 2012. And this was for the Autism Education Trust in the UK. And these quotes came from autistic children and young people with the average age of 10 and a half. So they were just about to go into secondary school in the UK. 95% of people don't understand me. Friends are overwhelming. Adults never leave me alone, and most worryingly was adults don't stop bullying me. Now, all of these quotes, for me, show a fundamental theory of mind. So what autistic people were often said to have problems or a deficit in, all of them show an understanding of other people and that other minds have different thoughts and ideas to oneself. What's a little bit different from your average 10-year-old is how much social disjuncture is coming across in these quotes. How there's a mismatch in understanding between themselves and other people. There's all kinds of things in those quotes you could look in further. But it shows both theory of mind but also social disjuncture. And the term double empathy problem was one I coined in the late 2000s. And I had just started attending a parent group regarding me and my son's needs. It's a kind of coffee morning meet-up group. And I started using this term, double empathy problem, to kind of describe how I was seeing things to the other parents in this group. because at the time there was this framing of a deficit in theory of mind. And I was reframing the problem as more as a case of mutual incomprehension or a mutual breakdown in interaction and understanding between autistic and non-autistic people that was not solely located in the mind of the autistic person, but rather in the way people with differing perspectives were trying to interact with one another. And if one thought about a theory of autistic mind, this often left quite a lot to be desired in a way. Not so much, say, a parent with 20, 30 years experience, they're going to have a pretty good theory of mind regarding their offspring. But this problem is probably going to be more marked the more one's interacting with a stranger or someone you've only just met. And later on I defined this in an academic paper that was published in 2012. I defined it as a disjuncture in reciprocity between two differently disposed social actors, which becomes more marked the wider the disjuncture in dispositional perceptions of the life world. A bit academic there, but perceived as a breach in the natural attitude of the way things seem to be to a person, and what constitutes social reality. And this was an everyday and somewhat traumatic experience for autistic people to go through. So to continuously, when growing up, have these disjunctures in interacting with other people. But it's framing this in a far more interactive sense between two differently disposed people. And you'll notice that this doesn't just mean autistic, non-autistic. It's any two people can have a breakdown in interaction and a misunderstanding. After I published about these ideas, work started appearing in autism research, particularly from psychology, which started coming to similar conclusions to what I had come to. So some work at the University of Nottingham investigated non-autistic people's ability to interpret the behavioural reactions of autistic people, and found that they were less successful at doing so than when they viewed non-autistic people in videos, apart from when autistic people were reacting to a joke. Stagg et al. Found that non-autistic adults rated autistic children as less expressive and less attractive than non-autistic children, just from brief snippets of videos. And this work was further supported in studies which showed non-autistic people often formed negative first impressions from just very small glimpses of autistic people. Brett Heisman and Gillespie in 2017 investigated perceptions and misperceptions between autistic people and their family members. And when asked about reasons for misunderstandings, family members often tended to cite an extreme impairment in social understanding on the part of the autistic person. So they're informed by the traditional theory, while autistic participants themselves reflected on both the self and other as causes of misunderstandings. So in a way, the traditional theories that put, in a sense, the blame on the autistic person for misunderstanding was actually a hindrance to better mutual misunderstanding, even within family units. So when a lot of this psychological work started appearing, I started contacting a lot of these researchers and said, oh, did you know I've written about these kinds of problems? And so eventually a group of academics kind of got together, and we've held different in-person events and online symposia, and some of these are available online. Talk about the research in more depth. And not only within psychology, but within other fields, these ideas have caught on somewhat. And interestingly, within neuroscience, a theory came out in 2017, which practically came to the same conclusions. And it was a bit of a mouthful, but the dialectical misattunement hypothesis, which viewed psychopathology not merely as disordered function within single brains, but also as a dynamic interpersonal mismatch that encompasses various levels of description. So even this term interpersonal mismatch, I had entitled my book that came out the same year, A Mismatch of Salience. So there was similar terms being used to describe these kinds of problems. But something I want to point out is that although a lot of this work's been happening in psychology and now neuroscience, that the concept originated in lived experience and within sociology. And it's important to remember this problem was conceptualized as situated within wider power relations in society. And so often it's one person has more power in a certain context to define the situation than another, and sometimes to define that person in various ways. And so to combat these issues, one also has to focus on rapport building, relationship building, and so on, but also in ceding power and in avoiding tokenistic gestures in participation. So it requires humility, not jumping to conclusions and interpretations too quickly. Means reducing the imposition of normative social expectations. And recently there was an article critiquing the double empathy problem as a bit of a woolly idea and hard to pin down, and that it shouldn't as yet be translated into practice. But to me, that was the part of the critique I disagreed with most, because what this teaches us to do is to see the interactive and contextual issues, to focus on humility and reflection and rapport building, which is never a perfect process, but an ongoing one. And these kinds of things, to me, are just good practice, whoever you're kind of working with. And it means a more collaborative approach in setting the research agenda, in the design and development of strategies and practical methods. And that's why I chair a network called the Participatory Autism Research Collective. And this kind of champions participatory work in the field. So a couple of quotes for me to conclude. This is a classic one from Jim Sinclair, an autistic advocate, from the quote from the early 1990s. Grant me the dignity of meeting me on my own terms. Recognize that we are equally alien to each other, that my ways of being are not merely damaged version of yours. question your assumptions, define your terms, and work with me to build bridges between us. And this was from a project I was involved with. When I'm in an environment I feel comfortable in, with people who are kind and tolerant and doing things I enjoy, then I'm as happy as the next person. So when people tell me I should think, speak, or behave differently, then I start to feel different, upset, isolated, and worthless. So surely the problem is a lack of fit with the environment, rather than something inside my brain that needs to be fixed. There you go. Lots of references.
Moltes gràcies. Passo la paraula a la doctora Callard.
So there's a strand in your work where you're sort of challenging that original Asperger quote, and you're challenging the claim that autistics lack empathy and have problems with theory of mind. That's on the one hand. But there's also a smaller strand where you are challenging the place of the quality of empathy. So here's like a quote. You say, emotional empathy is somewhat of a convenient illusion, constructed so that we feel less alone and isolated in our existential angst. Okay, so I just want to talk to me a little bit about, there's a little bit of a feel to me of like, there's a Kant story about like you give someone a pot and they say, it was broken when you gave it to me, and also you never gave it to me, or something, and because you're not giving it back. Do we want to do a critique of empathy, or do we want to claim empathy for autism?
Kind of both. It's not seeing empathy as some kind of perfect working operation to begin with, that it is a very messy and often inaccurate thing. And to me, we cannot really know what it's like to be someone else. And so there's a kind of, in the perfection side, it's impossible to empathize. Socrates and Plato in the old dialogues called it a kind of divine ability, like telepathy. And so to me, there's a kind of illusion, a convenient illusion, that's where that phrase comes from. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean, though, that we can't build better understanding and resonance, a feeling of connections, feelings of belonging, feelings of being better understood than you were previously or on other occasions. And we've all felt that emotional feeling where you feel intuitively understood or not, as the case may be. But to me, a kind of perfect empathy would be an illusion. So it's a kind of more a messy business of practice, in a sense. That's never hitting that full understanding.
Okay, but so what I'm hearing you saying is that maybe we'll never get to perfect empathy, but more empathy would be better. Yeah. I'm not even sure that's right. That is, like, I think empathy has a cost. In order to get you to empathize with some experience of mine, I have to put it in a form that you can grasp. I have to tell you the kind of story that you're accustomed to hear. And in fact, if I know that's like a plan for my whole life, that I want to be telling people the sorts of stories that they are going to be able to relate to empathetically, then I have to have the kind of experiences that will figure in the stories so that I can tell you those stories and you can relate to me. And like, what if I don't want that? or what if I want my experiences to be unconstrained by this kind of empathy requirement?
I think that's fine. I think there's a level where one shouldn't expect empathy, especially in very embodied experiences that might be quite different from one another, so sensory experiences and things. I don't think simulation activities are very useful for sort of disability training, things like that. And there's a level where one has to accept difference and that one's not going to experience what the other is experiencing. And sometimes one wouldn't want to. So if someone's in extreme mental distress and trauma and things, do you really want to be feeling what they're feeling? But a better, a more humble understanding which doesn't invalidate that other person's experience, I think would be what I would be trying to work towards. So a level of sympathy and avoidance of invalidation. So to accept other people will have these differing experiences that might be something beyond yours. Do you see what I mean with that?
Sort of. I guess I'm not always sure that I want my experiences validated or that I need them validated or that I always want to have that to be something to worry about.
I think it partly comes from, I guess, a personal thing in my own life of growing up being misunderstood, invalidated, not feeling listened to as a young child growing up. So that kind of being misframed and having your own framings and narrative kind of talked over or not well connected with, in a sense. So it's and the negative impact that can have on self-esteem, belonging and so forth. So I think empathy can be overrated and it's not the be-all and end-all by any means, but I think having a spaces where you're accepted for what you are, I guess, and can feel some connection and belonging, I think, is a potentially useful thing. Because a lack of it can lead to loneliness, isolation, and feelings of frustration, all sorts of negative impacts from it. Because I think autistic people are social beings just like anyone else. It just comes across differently in a way.
I want to read you a quote from an op-ed in the New York Times from October and then ask you a question about it. It's called, "The Autism Spectrum is Too Broad." When I tell strangers that my daughter is autistic, their questions are often so far from my reality it's painful. Does she have a unique talent, special interests? They picture a child who excels at puzzles. But my daughter hasn't shown an interest in toys since she was 20 months old. She's unable to tell me what she wants to be for Halloween or when she grows up. I fear illnesses like strep throat because she cannot tell me she's in pain. It's difficult to have a national conversation about a condition that includes Elon Musk, Greta Thunberg, and my 7-year-old nonverbal daughter who will probably need 24/7 care for the rest of her life. That's why families like mine want a distinct diagnostic category for our children that clarifies our challenges and what we need from the medical community. So I wonder, do you agree that we should have a distinct diagnostic category of that kind? And if not, why not?
No, not right now. because I don't think it actually adds to anything. The proposal at the moment is this term profound autism. Mm-hmm. And that suggests that what type of autism do you have if it's not profound? And is it
shallow kind?
Mild, shallow? Is this doing a disservice to all the other autistic people and any difficulties they might face? So it causes as many problems as it might help. And my son would be clearly categorized in this category of autistic people. And calling it profound, what's that going to add to his support workers or his psychiatrist? Absolutely nothing. There's already terms like severe learning disability, high support needs. We don't need another vague category in a way. Because when they did have separate categories like Asperger's syndrome, PDD, NOS and all of this, there was clinical confusion, and so one clinician would diagnose Asperger's and someone down the road would be diagnosing high-functioning autism and things. So it led to problems in practice, and there is no neat categories to subcategorize. And it's a very nebulous category to begin with. So subcategorizing it causes problems. And to me, you need a person-centered approach. So autism is potentially a useful signpost, but if you just said, my son's autistic, doesn't really tell you much about my son. If you say he's got severe learning disabilities, largely non-speaking, severe sensory sensitivities, he's got hyperacusis and kind of hearing issues, and that gives you a bit more information. If I told you his favourite interest is music and looking up tunes on YouTube, this is telling you about my son. The word autism or profound autism makes no difference at all, and it doesn't help researchers. It's to me, it's not improving the situation in any way, and it's just going to cause more problems. And there's a bit in the narrative there where it's kind of seeking a kind of medical treatment, and I think it's a bit of a false hope in a way, because it's not that kind of problem. You're talking about development and a description of development, which has kind of already happened. And so a treatment would be a negation of those kinds of developments happening in the first place. And to me, that's kind of not something I would want to see, or it has a eugenicist tone to it. So to me, it's about supporting the people who are already here as best we can. And so my son will always have 24/7 care needs, and will always struggle with certain things, but he can have either a very good quality of life and be well supported, or the opposite. And so this is the difference we can make in people's lives, and what I think people should be focusing their efforts on.
It's kind of a famous fact, I think, about autistic people that we are high variance. I'm sometimes inclined to think we differ more from one another than non-autistic people do differ from one another, I mean. And I wonder what kind of does that stand in the way of our forming an interest group or indeed a group? Like you were just saying, well, autistic doesn't give you that much information about your son. You have to say a lot more things. That makes a lot of sense to me. But like, what work does it do?
I think there has been a kind of cultural impact around identity, and that has been powerful and useful for a lot of people, myself included, in terms of, in some ways, the term neurodivergence perhaps is acknowledging that there are people who fall outside social norms and expectations, and that has an impact on your place in society. I think it's a useful self-knowledge and potential connection on a community and political level. So you can have an autistic-led event with predominantly autistic people with a great range of diverse temperaments and ways. But there's a community acceptance. There's a kind of non-judgmental calmness about these community events. There's a culture that's come about from them, which I think's a positive one. They don't suit all autistic people, and you get autistic people who build their hopes up of finding a community and empathy with others, and then go to an event and it's like, I didn't find that at all. and it's no sort of panacea, but I think it's certainly helpful just to get with a group of people and to discuss sensory issues or how navigating a certain thing in life or a system that one's dealing with. And I think it's often most useful post-diagnosis. So I was most in need of that community connection after I was beginning to identify as autistic. So I needed other autistic people to find myself in that sense, or what this meant for me. You know, I wanted to sample more autistic people and what's this about. So I think there's a lot of positives on a general sense there.
I have an autistic friend. I have many, but this one in particular, he's so annoying. He interrupts all the time. And the thing that I've learned by investigating his interrupting, which has now been, years and years, is actually he doesn't interrupt more than most people, but he doesn't cover it up. So I learned this by watching in social settings. We all interrupt each other, but we do like a little Jedi mind trick after we interrupt the person, where we sort of say some things that make them forget that they were even going to say anything next. There's like tricks to how you interrupt. We also interrupt at the right times, in the right ways. We have a feel he does not have any feel for how to interrupt, so he just interrupts. Okay. There's a million other things. When he's teasing me, it feels to me like he's insulting me. He's always rushing. No matter what's happening, he's always hurrying and rushing, even if we're just having dinner. Oh, is the waiter coming? Okay. I could go on and on and on and on. That's on the one hand. That is, he is, and I'm putting this on him, right? And when we talk about this, he's like, well, you're really intolerant. And we have a lot of arguments about this. I'm no piece of cake either. But we have this kind of set of constantly confronting the set of social problems. Okay. On the one hand. On the other hand, you're like, why are you friends with this guy? He's the most interesting person that I know. Whenever he interrupts me, this makes it even more maddening to say something more interesting than the thing I was saying. And like he just can't be boring. Like most people are boring most of the time. And he can't be boring. He's not able to be boring. Whenever he says something, it adds something, some new insight, whatever. I feel like these two things are connected about him. And like I feel like a lot of life consists of sometimes in my head I call it the interaction tax. It's like to be interacting with anyone, you have to pay a big tax. And that tax is like, you have to be nice and you have to be friendly and you have to say the normal thing and you have to make sure the interaction goes the way that it normally goes. And he's just like, how about if I don't pay it? And just interact without paying it. And that's his kind of autistic strategy. I guess it's not a question. I wonder, what do you think about this? And do you think that this illustrates or brings out something more general about autism?
Not quite sure what I'm commenting on with the question, but I mean, I've certainly come across many autistic characters. Even what you were saying made me think of one of my daughters who struggles in making friends, social interactions, but kind of would like to, or would like to do a better job of it, but just has an interaction style which isn't kind of picking up on those things often. So when she does talk with a peer or something when they're playing, she tends to just stream of consciousness kind of talk at them. Mm-hmm. And they can lose interest or feel a bit estranged by it. And so she does struggle to connect with her peers, other than her sister, who they get on absolutely fine most of the time, and have quite intuitive understanding. So I think it's with this interaction tax and things, there's a lot of things that I think are quite taxing to do, and possibly that bit more so for autistic people, or it doesn't fully register that this is even a need to do or an expectation. But not doing so can cause a kind of affront or a breach of expectations. And this breaching of expectation back and forth is really a kind of core of the double empathy problem. But that's why some level of better understanding at least empowers you as an actor within an interaction, might give you a level of more choice in the matter if you know that you're coming across to someone in a certain way. You may not be able to do that much about it, but at least some self-knowledge, I think, is helpful. Not always, so telling my 7-year-old daughter that she's talking at people wouldn't be very helpful. But there are ways, I think, of gaining better self-understanding at least, and then that gives more power to act in a situation or choose to be in situations where that communication style is more accepted and rewarded or what have you. So I think self-knowledge is always a good thing in that sense of what you can do with that information in a sense. I'm not sure if that was commenting on what you wanted me to comment on.
I want to ask you about monotropism. This is an interesting idea that I came across in your work as a model for autism, the monotropic mind. Can you maybe just say a sentence, explain what it is?
Well, monotropism, there's kind of different versions of it, but the one I like the most comes from the work of Dinah Murray, who's sadly passed away now, but was a very good friend of mine. And they saw monotropism as really about interest, and how as people, our interest is drawn to something or not, as it were. And that, so that it's more a perceptual interest, so it goes beyond simple attention perceptually. There's a motivational aspect to it, or even if it's unconscious kind of thing. But any person has a scarce amount of attention that they can give at any one moment. So I can carry on talking to you and flip this clicker in my hand, but doing the two things at once makes both things more difficult. But if someone was to throw a ball at my head right now, I'd be in trouble. So doing three things at once is pretty much impossible. So everyone has to kind of deploy their attention in a given context. And so I think there's a link between this and sensory sensitivities. So if you have less sensory filters, more easily overwhelmed by incoming information, then a purposeful strategy would be to try and block some of that information out. And so sometimes you'll see autistic people needing to physically do this. So my son will crunch his ears up and sort of shield himself from input. But also things like getting totally absorbed in an activity, sort of flow state activities, are more generally positive experiences, but it helps to focus attention and interest and helps reduce overwhelm and kind of fragmentation of perception. And so I think there's this kind of connection with autistic perception and getting completely absorbed in things, or being a bit one-tracked. So something you'll notice is when you're fully in flow in an absorbing activity, changing from that onto something else can feel like a real sort of wrench away. And so with my daughter, it's trying to get her to stop one activity to say, go to school or do something on time is always a problem, because you're having to prepare well in advance, because just doesn't like forced transitions at all. But there's great gifts and benefits that this kind of attention can give. So the kind of persistence and dedication to a task, and if it holds enough interest, then this is where you get autistic specialists and expertise. And so one person's interest could be completely different to the next. So I like philosophy and theory and things, and I like table tennis, which I've done my whole life. And there's certain interests that I've gotten to a good level at. At the same time, there's activities which don't hold any interest to me whatsoever. And so gardening, it's all sort of sensory, but then you'll have another autistic guy was on TV in the UK because he was an award-winning gardener at Chelsea Flower Show and had a series of designing gardens in a very sort of autistic pattern thinking way. And so these sensibilities can come out in all kinds of different ways, but it's more that intensity of focus which is the similarity. So but it tends to come out in a profile of interest on one hand and avoidance on the other, the things that one just doesn't want to touch with a barge pole, if you know that phrase. So keep away.
So now, so when you, when I first read about this in your work referencing Murray, I thought it was, you used the example of the diffuse light versus the torch beam, and I thought of it as being a claim about attention, but now it sort of seems more like the kind of spiky profile of interests, where there'll be like some things that interest you intensely and then other things that interest you not at all, where the idea would be that for the non-autistic person, their interests would be more closer to the middle in all of those cases. So it's more like the second point then.
A bit less intense. So it's that intensity of interest. So, I mean, autistic people often talk about holding interest for a lifetime or a decade, or if something doesn't work out, then you sort of try it for a while and then it just fades off the scene completely. And and it's an interesting one where you have a mixture of kind of autism and ADHD, because that's kind of, there can be pattern thinking and absorption and things like this, but also flicking attention or interest. So I see a bit more of that with my other daughter, actually, with this kind of being heavily involved and absorbed in one activity, and then something breaks attention and suddenly she's absorbed in something completely different. And as if like you just suddenly jumped from one scene to another kind of thing, but didn't faze her at all, kind of thing. And I think if that happened to my other daughter, it just, oh no, I can't deal with this rapid change. And so the other aspects of monotropism, it comes more from Wen Lawson's work, and that's more the attentional side and the narrow torch beam. But I liken that to kind of flow state absorption. So in a flow state, you're so absorbed in an activity that attention elsewhere just fades completely. So you might lose track of time, lose track of all kinds of things, because everything's in the moment. And I feel that there's a kind of autistic tendency towards that perceptually as well. I often say of my son that he's in a perpetual present, so he's always in the here and now, and talking about the future or the past to him doesn't make a great deal of sense. And I think that's a bit of an autistic tendency generally, but is even more extreme in, say, my son's case. Which is a quite interesting interaction to have when everything's more sort of vivid in a way.
I thought of the follow-up question that I wanted to ask you about my friend. I think you're going to say no about this suggestion, but I want to make a suggestion. So like you, in one of your papers, now I can't remember which because they're kind of blurring in my head, but you sort of make reference to this, Goffman, Garfinkel sociology research that, and I was wondering whether we couldn't use that to sort of pivot from the autistics can't read minds or don't have empathy to they participate less in the construction, reception, repair of social reality.
Yeah, that fits.
Sorry, you're going to disagree.
No, I think that fits.
Okay, so that's what I think I'm picking up on in my friend. That since less of his energy is going to that, there's other energy that's available.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that makes sense. Because and there's more interest and motivation for him in doing those other things. And so, as an example, whenever I go to a particular takeaway restaurant, I'll usually order exactly the same thing every time. And it cuts down on the kind of indecision over the mundane. And so I can not have to worry about making a decision which really doesn't matter that much, as long as I get something edible that I quite like. And so I end up just getting the same thing every time. But to me it frees up headspace to do more interesting things with my interest. So it relates to monotropism, I guess, and prioritizing, I guess. And I do think there's different weightings in autistic perception. So another common one is not really seeing status and hierarchy in others. It's like, that's all a bit silly, really, and a pantomime, and so I'm not going to play that game. And it's interesting because you can get away with things socially that other people would feel uncomfortable with. So, like when I first met Simon Baron-Cohen, I had no trouble critiquing him to his face, and sort of in a polite way, but like there was no fear of status there. My daughter, one of them is very socially aware and a bit anxious. Not sure about this. The other one just, well, hello, I'm Flo. If she feels the need to say that, she'll just go in and say it. Why should I be embarrassed? And so what's salient and important within a given context can be differently weighted, and that leads to wanting different things out of an interaction. Or so I guess your friend, to make that kind of effort would be so overwhelming and draining for him that he'd rather just be in company where he doesn't need to make that effort so much, or wouldn't be judged so much for not doing so.
When he tries to do it, it's even worse. When he tries to follow my instructions, he follows them in his weird autistic way, and it's very literal, and So no, I think he's willing to try, but the attempts create another level of failure. That's my experience.
It's too much conscious effort.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's not smooth.
I've seen this happen with autistic people in job interviews, where they're trying to remember 10 million bits of advice they've been told, and then they end up having a shutdown and completely falling apart, not being able to say anything, because they're overthinking all the parameters. And in many ways, the normal advice for a job interview, do this, do that, is bad advice because it leads to that over-analyzing. And the more authentic and comfortable an autistic person is, so the less they're double-thinking things, the more naturally they're going to come across in a job interview and they'll do better, even if misjudged and things. So, in a sense, loading your thoughts up with too much to think about is a hindrance. So, to make a table tennis analogy, if you gave a beginner 10 million instructions way above their level, it's just confuse them and they'll be frozen. So similar things happening, in a sense, when people are trying to do too much too quickly, in a way.
You distinguish between what you see as a bad mode of dealing with, in this context you're talking about autistic children specifically, I'm quoting, this is like the approach of behavioral modification so that children are socialized into behaviors that are socially functional for future roles. It's on the one hand. And the good way, which is interactive mutuality concerned with the empowerment of individuals and communities, where, I'm smooshing some sentences of yours together, dominance and the imposition of authority are seen as dysfunctional. Okay, so there's like the bad way and the good way. So I had a couple questions about this. So on the one hand, it kind of just sounds like the good way for dealing with autistics is the good way for dealing with anybody. And that, you have guidelines for practitioners of people who are working with autistic children, and your guidelines, I'll read them. I think they would work for all students. Like, respect individual learning style, consider sensory issues, consider how your processing of information may be different from that of your pupil, utilize the people in your care, utilize interest, stress is an important issue, collaborate for consistency. So, and a lot of the stuff you were saying,
universal.
Yeah, a lot of stuff you were saying earlier about kindness and tolerance and et cetera, it really does just sound like a universal ethics and is not specific to autism. Does that strike you as right?
Pretty much, because it's the problem, I guess, is these things often are not done with autistic people. Maybe by treating them as a pathologized other, you're actually taking people away from that those opportunities, maybe. And it's lost myself a bit. If you can just remind.
Yeah. I'll tell you where I thought your train of thought was going, and you can tell me if that's right or not. But that, on some level, your set of guidelines for how to, practitioners who are dealing with autistic children could work for everyone. And maybe the thought is that where we are antecedently is that we actually make exceptions. That is, we don't apply the ethics that we've already got for everybody. We don't apply it to autistic people because we think that they are somehow an ethical exception, that they can't be treated like everybody else. And that if we just, in effect, we're just dehumanizing them and thus taking them out of the category of people we treat with respect. And so then just the ordinary garden variety respect will do.
I think with the added caveat maybe, but that by doing these things, what you get may be a bit unexpected, but to roll with it anyway. That kind of... I've heard people use the term radical acceptance, you know, that these kind of things in with parenting and working with others. It's that the truly mutual sense and not imposing normalcy, I guess, onto autistic people. That mutual respect. And so, yes, if you stuck to those core ethics in many ways, you wouldn't have such a problem in the first place. So I remember doing a talk for a conference around counselling, and I was basically reminding them of what a counsellor is meant to do in the first place, kind of thing. Build a therapeutic relationship, that's what it's about. And to kind of... And often my advice is around that, like with parents, often their intuitions are more accurate, I think, than a lot of the clinical advice they're given. And it's like, you know your child probably better than anyone who's advising you, and it's, is this making sense to you? Does it connect with what you're experiencing? Because sometimes parents will follow some advice because just the expert said so, but will have a gut feeling this doesn't feel quite right, then try it out and it's like, no, it wasn't right and I was right all along. And it's sometimes it's trusting ourselves as well as a humility with others, but also a criticality of ourselves and others. It's a fine balance I find with all of this. But I think often the kind of clinical medical pathology framing and model can lead to a kind of dehumanizing at times, or not allowing that space, or imposing on people.
Okay, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I wanted to query this dominance and imposition of authority are seen as dysfunctional, because I guess I think, like, say with parenting, I think there's some dominance and imposition of authority.
Oh, yeah.
You know, everything from grabbing, when, you know, I don't have any toddlers anymore, but once I did, grabbing them so they don't run into the road, to telling them that they have to do their homework, or it feels like that is a part of parenting, to me anyway. And I wonder what you think about that. Is that just like me doing bad parenting, or is it, or do we want to say somehow that strand of parenting is less appropriate with autistic children?
No, I think there's a fine balance with all of these things, and I think we all have a kind of somewhat differing or moving position on these issues. But things like fitting into what everyone else is doing for your own good, these kinds of things. And then on the other hand, total freedom of diversity and acceptance and so on. And there's always going to be a balance of getting along with other people, in essence. So your friend, I guess, is a good example. And so, but for each of us, this is going to be a somewhat differing judgment. And so how your friend judges the need to fit in with his own need, and how he balances that is his own, up to him in a way. And I think Generally, I'm more into the live and let live, be accepting as possible and liberal as possible. And as a parent, I know one can't always do that, or sometimes you just have to get something done, and there's a level of imposition in life, and just in social life we impose on one another. But it's more about reducing the impact of, or the negative impact of imposition, or unnecessary impact, or unnecessary imposition. So why would you, as a parent, impose more rules than needed, or more barriers to freedom and flexibility than is useful or for that person or the family's well-being? And so I think this is probably far more of an art than a science, and parents are going to range from laissez-faire to authoritarian, I guess, and all the grey area in between. And I'm not going to judge someone who imposes a bit more than I do, but I just think it's something to keep in mind, that if we are imposing on someone else, why? Is it needed? Is there a better way we can act in this regard, which is freeing for that person or less imposing in a negative way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I had a question about the kind of, what you said, what you get might be a bit unexpected, but you could roll with it anyways, and you don't need to impose normalcy. And I guess my thought is, imposing normalcy is actually just a huge part of human life. We're kind of doing it all the time in a million ways. I mean, you know this better than I do because you're a sociologist. And I want to read a quote from a different, from somewhere else. Okay, you say, attribution, it's a clause, I'm sorry, I didn't quote the whole sentence. Attributions of a disordered disposition being the somewhat arbitrary decisions of those with power in society to shape how the less powerful others are perceived. So that makes it seem like, maybe my friend is just the sort of victim of people with power shaping how other people are perceived. And
he's in a minority.
Right, that's true, but the point about the unexpectedness, right? So, I think it's hard to deal with people who are unexpected, who are unpredictable, right? Not hard because of people in power, but just hard, actually really objectively hard. Because we're always trying to predict each other, and we're trying to coordinate behavior, and unpredictability makes that objectively harder. And so, when what you get might be, and I know that, I know the costs I impose on the people around me by being unpredictable. I feel like those are just real costs. And it's not to disagree with anything about the role with it anyways, but I want to know what you think about that. Do you think, no, there are some real costs, and that the imposing of normalcy might just be a deep fact about social life, not an arbitrary imposition of power?
It is a fact of life in many respects, but I think it can verge into an unthinking of use of power. So if you think of the term ableism, the kind of unconscious bias towards the abled, or again, not including the needs of the disabled and so on. There's a normative aspect to who's included and who isn't, who gets left out, who's understood, whose behaviour is acceptable, whose isn't, and so on. And so, for your friend's well-being, is accepting his way of interacting and kind of rolling with it, although it's difficult for you, does that make life easier for him? And I would guess yes. Do you see what I mean? So it's...
Yeah, it would be if I accept. I don't accept it. I mean, I just complain about it all the time. And I think a big part of why I stay friends with him is he's okay with me complaining about it.
Yeah.
He would be fine with me telling you all about this. And in the way that I've described him, he'd be like, yeah, okay. And that, to me, that's what makes it okay, is that I don't have to accept it. I can be like, this is super annoying. And then I can be like, I get that I actually don't have a real complaint here, in the sense that actually you're not objectively hurting anybody when you interrupt them, right? So he's not actually, I'm getting annoyed by something, I'm not actually being hurt by it. So I understand that. That's part of actually what makes it kind of maddening to me. It's like, why am I finding this so bad when in fact he's not actually doing anything wrong? But so no, I don't actually think I accept it. And I don't roll with it very well. But you know, I don't run away either. I keep talking to him.
The level of emotional, not judging it as you're in the wrong or you're bad or you need to change because that's what's normal. And this, I'm not quite getting this, but how you are accepting on one level, if not on another. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yes, there's a lot of different kinds of acceptance, I think, yes.
So in that sense of non-judgmental acceptance of his way of being and his way of acting is not your choice or your preference, but it's you accept that he has good reason for doing it his way. And that allows a sense of mutual acceptance, even if there's annoyance there. There's a kind of acceptance in the annoyance, almost.
I wanted to ask you about, there's a thing you say in one of your papers, you describe, you're sort of lamenting, an increasing complacency around the idea that lead professionals and practitioners have a good understanding of what good autism practice entails. And suppose it's true, suppose not only practitioners, suppose I don't understand what good autism practice entails in relation to my friend or in relation to myself. Right? So suppose that's the situation we're in. We're dealing with autistic people, some of us are autistic people, and we don't know what good autism practice entails. And then the question is, okay, what should you do? That is, what should you do when you don't know what to do? And you gave one answer, which is like humility. But I feel like that's not enough of an answer. That is, it's too negative or something. I mean, maybe the answer is just defaulting to standard ethics, like just treat people with respect and consideration. But like these professionals and practitioners, like if they were to come to agree with you that they don't know what to do, what would they then do?
Well, I think positive practice comes from a willingness, in a sense, a reflective practitioner, basically, is someone looking back over what their practice is, how they might change it in the future, what works, what doesn't, being mutual, humble, all of these qualities. It is, in essence, just, as you say, good ethical practice of working with other people. So if you were working with someone from a completely different culture that you have no experience of, or language barriers and things, ideally you would probably have a similar starting point of humility and building rapport, building understanding, and so on. Not trying to impose your understandings on something you don't really understand. So it's, I think there's, it's hard to pin down, and it's more a philosophy of practice and person-centered practice, whatever one wants to call it. But to me, there's a lot of what I was commenting on in that article was around some of the educational interventions that are seems evidence-based or good autism practice when it's these things have quite questionable a lot of the time, or not, shouldn't be universally applied, or should be done in a person-centered way. So I think there's sometimes a complacency of, oh, we can just take this intervention off a shelf and just apply it to people, and it will somehow improve their lot in life. I think that's kind of not how these things operate in reality. So I think, say, teaching as a profession and what makes a good teacher or counsellor, a lot of these things are quite vague, woolly ideas, but it's how they're implemented in practice, I guess, is that whether they're ethically happening or not on the ground, if they're felt by the people involved. And to me, that is an ongoing, imperfect kind of process, really. And so I do use terms like rapport building, relationship building, humility, ceding power, avoiding tokenistic gestures. And we don't always get this right, or we may not be the best person to be implementing that practice for that individual. So if you're in a work situation and the client is someone who really annoys you personally, but doesn't with a colleague, then why isn't your colleague working with them instead? Do you see? With a friend, you've got a lot of benefits as well as things you find annoying from them. So there's good reason for you to stick at it. So, but at least with that mutual understanding, they'll know what they do that's beneficial to you and what they do which you might find annoying. So at least that mutual knowledge can potentially aid both of you as you move forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I only have a tiny bit of time left, so I want to ask you about sort of incorporating autistic voices. So you say it's of great importance for greater engagement of autistic people with the research process, from topic selection to design and interpretation of findings. You're calling for a more participatory process. So I wonder, is this a claim? I'm once again interested in the scope of the claim. So is this a claim that you would just make for any group, for like cancer patients, depression, tourism? Like should, a city consult the voices of its tourists to understand what its tourist policy should be? Like should any group, should their sort of subjective, reports of their lived experience is just always universally important in analyzing that group, or is there something special about autism that makes this true, and what is it?
I mean, I'm generally pro-participatory methods with all groups. I guess what was somewhat different for autistic people was, traditionally at least, we weren't really listened to or given much value in terms of defining our own experience and what it is to be autistic. So there is a kind of disempowerment, I guess. Some people call it like epistemic injustice type issues, where, similar to other oppressed or minority groups socially, I guess, there's a similarity there in wanting to define one's own experience and be listened to politically on these kind of issues. And so I guess that isn't even specific to autism or neurodivergence, but it's that kind of there is something about that experience which has made this more of a political priority, I guess, or a problem to raise. So, like, the term "nothing about us without us" came from disability politics more generally. Mm-hmm. So it's that same notion, really. But representation is another very imperfect thing in life. So does anyone feel that they're well politically represented? Probably not. So, or there's obvious problems there, but like, and you don't speak for all autistic people. It's like, well, no, nobody does. You know, it's just because it's difficult and problematic doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to do more of it or improve it. So, to me, participation is just a kind of ideal to always be working towards. And it's always going to be imperfect and messy, but it's something we can always strive to do better with, I think.
No sé si hauríem de... perquè, bueno, jo estaria aquí tot el vespre, però no tenim temps, perquè ens faran fora a les 8. Llavors, sí que obriria ara el torn de preguntes. No sé si... Mira, aquí tenim... Mira, sí, ara aquí ve la companya.
Bon dia, em dic Lluís Cano, jo sóc metge. Volia saber quins altres trastorns serien inclosos dintre de la neurodivergència, amb el sentit que sigui aplicable tot això de la doble empatia i de totes aquestes coses. Gràcies.
To me, neurodiversity or neurodivergence is more of a social categorization. So those who fall outside social norms of neurodevelopment, in a sense. And so it's quite a broad category of people there. And so I've recently been involved in a group where there's people talking about traumatic brain injury with dementia and things like that. And people have been applying these ideas to sort of double empathy problem and dementia. So an academic friend of mine recently wrote a book chapter on that topic. And so I wouldn't want to overclaim myself personally, but there are many people seeing relevance and use in ideas around neurodiversity. And so, you could say anything which falls outside norms and expectations in terms of neurodevelopment. So a particularly gifted child educationally, you could say, is neurodivergent. It's diverging from the norm of childhood milestones, I think. So as a basic term, it's pretty broad, I would say. Double empathy problem, as I say, can relate to breakdowns between any two people. I think what's specifically a bit different about the autism context is that autistic people were seen as deficient in social interaction and communication itself, which isn't, well, somewhat the case with other disorders, but not quite as concentrated as a defining feature. So to me it was something that needed unsettling a bit, and that needed to be shown to be as socially situated as it is, the breakdowns between autistic and non-autistic. But I think these kinds of issues and the power dynamics are very relevant for things like dementia and traumatic brain injury and other areas. So I hope that helps.
No sé si... Mira, per allà al fons tenim algú.
So you mentioned earlier Simon Baron-Cohen. In fact, I don't know if you had the chance to see, there was an article this weekend in the Financial Times where he makes the case, it's called The Politics of Autism, to differentiate in categories. He accepts the objection about using the word profound, but he makes the case for separating into categories autism type 1 and 2. So my question would be whether your criticism is with the categorization in general or just the use of profound.
Could you just explain what the type 1, type 2 distinction is?
So it's, I can't remember exactly which one is which, but it's the level of other things. So it would be like the autism versus Asperger kind of differentiation. It's about learning disabilities, the need for 24/7 assistance. So it's basically equating profound and not profound with type 1 and 2, instead of using the word profound, which has other implications which you touched upon earlier.
I mean, we've currently pretty much got that anyway. In the DSM, there's categorizations on severity of need, so type 1, 2 and 3, rather than just 2. And this is quite a crude general categorization. To me, some differentiation is needed, but to me, the ICD just has autism with or without intellectual impairment or learning disability. So it's, to me, that probably makes more sense as a categorization system. But then categorization systems are there for bureaucratic kind of reasons, and we do need them, like who falls into this category or not, and the various impacts of that. But in a sense, we've already got these categories in the DSM and in the ICD. So I haven't read the article, so I'm not exactly sure what he's arguing for, other than we need the current state of play as it is. I don't think these subcategories particularly add much, though, to the of benefit, more than the ones we already have. And will these categories improve, or will we have different categories, potentially more accurate ones in the future? Probably. At the moment, though, they're very crude subcategories, and I don't see much more benefit from further subdivisions or different terms than ones we're already using, to be blunt. So I'll have to read the article, but I'm not a huge fan of the profound autism change, because without the profound thing, we've already got these categorization systems anyway.
No sé si tenim alguna altra pregunta. perquè jo en tinc una, si no tenim ningú, si no, bueno, si d'allò, si me'n podeu interrompre, Però, de fet, és una pregunta pels dos. Jo crec que a l'Agnes l'havia sentit parlar abans de l'estiu i un aspecte que va sortir en aquella xerrada és si l'empatia realment és una part inherent de la naturalesa humana, és a dir, tots naixem amb empatia o és una habilitat que realment la tenim més o menys per la mà? Però si és així, realment si és una habilitat amb la qual tots podem tenir la sort o la no sort de tenir-la amb una millor capacitat, si li podem dir així, la podríem entrenar. L'altre dia llegia un article que deien que, no sé si era a Noruega, perquè ara no ho recordo, algunes escoles estaven fent com un programa pilot per entrenar l'empatia en els nens, com també una part també de programa anti-bullying, per exemple. Llavors la meva pregunta seria, es pot entrenar l'empatia? I si és així, realment com ho podem fer? Ara, abans m'ha semblat entendre que el Damian deia que potser les simulacions de vegades no sé si són molt exitoses, com ens podem realment posar en la pell d'una altra persona, perquè com a professionals, els que treballem amb persones, més enllà de la neurodivergència, és el que dèiem, tots necessitem, en tot cas, finalment estar en societat i entendre'ns els uns als altres, com ho podem fer per fer-ho millor?
I guess I think there is a question that comes first before how, which is should we? And I think maybe in some contexts, yes, but just as like a cautionary note, I don't think of myself as being very empathetic. That is, I'm probably pretty far at the not very empathetic end of the spectrum. And I don't mind being that way. I wouldn't want to be more empathetic than I am. It lets me get a lot done to not be so empathetic. And it means I'm not burdened with the emotions of other people all the time. Now, I think one thing you have to be is ethical. You have to be a good person. You have to treat people well. You have to treat them with respect. That doesn't necessarily involve empathy, in my view. It doesn't necessarily involve somehow imitating or mimicking sort of the mindset of the person that you're interacting with. Damian has some really interesting work connecting with Iris Marion Young's work about how treating people well doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be similar to them or grasp who they are. And that it's possible for respect to be kind of an attitude of wonder at a kind of difference. So I want to, that's one kind of cautionary space I want to make is maybe not all of us are cut out to be super empathetic. That might be okay. I also think it's worth, we live in a culture that really valorizes empathy, but I think that's partly because we don't take a hard look at the dark side of empathy. And I think there is a real dark side of empathy. That is, I think that the deep and visceral pleasure that people take in revenge is an empathetic pleasure and is conditioned on empathy. That is, you're imagining, in order to really take pleasure in revenge and in cruelty, you have to kind of imagine the suffering that the other person is experiencing. Imagine it for yourself, and then you take pleasure in it, right? So you have an opposite reaction to the empathetic thought, but you still have the empathetic thought. So we can use empathy for good or ill. I do think it's a skill. It's a genuine skill, right? But skills can be used, as Aristotle will say, the doctor's skill can also be used to poison and kill. So these are some thoughts about, maybe some worries about the idea that we got to train everybody into empathy. I tend to think that, empathy is not exactly innate because who's ever met an empathetic baby or even an empathetic, toddlers are not very empathetic. But probably there is something like a potentiality for, I would guess, this is outside my area of expertise, probably there is a potentiality for it that is innate, probably to differing degrees in different people. And there probably is some stuff you could do to develop that potentiality more. Most likely it would be at a younger age. I guess the question you have to ask is, like, what is the cost of doing that stuff? Like, as Damian was bringing out, we don't always know what we're doing when we're intervening. So there, I think it would just be a kind of question for like the ethics of intervention on that particular point.
It's an odd term, empathy, and what aspect of it is one trying to improve or train? So it's so I don't think it's just a simple skill that one can train in and improve at and be better at. So you can meet people who identify as empathizers, who pride themselves in their empathy, and yet in interaction with me might get really confused and I can't work this guy out, and sort of all my usual tricks are not working on this one, you know. And so I don't think it's one thing. In a sense, there's different aspects to what we call our empathy. I mean, certain aspects, I think, probably can be trained somewhat, at least, or there's certain aspects one can improve one's ability in or have more experience of, and so on. Is it always a good thing? No, I'd agree with Agnes a lot. It's very strongly there. I think if you look at apathy, antipathy, dyspathy, all these terms, they're part of the same emotional thing which drives empathy. So social identity theory and social psychology, so insiders and outsiders, in-groups, out-group, stigmas and discrimination, all come from the same place, so it's not always a good thing. And it can lead to misapplication. So someone may think they're empathizing, but are actually not emotionally connecting, and then they're imposing a misinterpretation, which causes more upset and potential impact. So, I don't necessarily think we should be training people in empathy. What we should be training people in is a kind of more practical mutual understanding and ethics. So it's that reflective practitioner, ethical treatment, therapeutic relationships, the kind of stuff which is core for a reason in a lot of these professions. Do we need to do more than that? Maybe sort of people having experience at working with a wide range of autistic people, so they're not going in sort of cold to it. So it might be quite dangerous to be a sort of therapist when you've had no practice with autistic people knowingly in the past. I'd think, well, you might want to work shadow or do a project, find out a bit more before you sort of throw yourself in there. But it's, I mean, that kind of building up practical experience and wisdom, I guess, rather than, I don't think it's a sort of set of skills one can just do a course in, you know.
Mira, aquí tenim. Jo crec que ja serà l'última.
Sí, la inteligencia artificial no se podía obviar ni en esta charla ni en ninguna otra. Creo que siempre hay que hablar de la inteligencia artificial. Yo creo que la inteligencia artificial puede simular o imitar la empatía cognitiva. No hay experimentos, le pregunto al doctor Milton, en los que se haya utilizado la inteligencia artificial para acelerar la comprensión de la empatía cognitiva entre autistas o personas con altas capacidades? Gracias.
I only caught the end of the question because my translator was...
Yo pienso que la inteligencia artificial puede simular o imitar la doble, como hemos dicho, empatía cognitiva y puede acelerar mucho ayudando a los psicoterapeutas a entender la diversidad empática cognitiva de los autistas. ¿No cree que puede ser una herramienta útil? O pregunto, ¿se ha utilizado ya experimentos con inteligencia artificial en este sentido?
I don't, so far, know of any using artificial intelligence. There are various works using robots and as interaction partners for various methods and goals. I don't know of any utilising AI though, or how AI might be helped as an aid in mutual understanding, things like this. I think that's possibly a new frontier in many respects. In terms of research. Not something I'm fully up on, but because I suspect there probably is some work out there being done, but I might not know of it. So,
Bueno, moltes gràcies al doctor Milton, moltes gràcies a la doctora Callard per haver vingut a Barcelona, moltes gràcies a tots per venir. Ara ja la propera activitat oberta ja sí que serà com a final de curs. Ara aquesta convocatòria de la Caixa ens emplaça a fer unes activitats en obert i després unes altres que ja són en públic reduït. Però nosaltres el que farem és, estem gravant un petit documental, com un 30 minuts de tot el cicle, i el passarem al final de tot, serà al juny, o sigui que ja us avisarem igualment, encara falten uns quants mesos, però si ens voleu tornar a acompanyar per veure com ha anat tot i per una mica recapitular totes aquestes reflexions plegats, doncs estarem ben contents. I ara ens enduem realment molta teca per pensar i reflexionar i donar-vos les gràcies de nou i ens veiem ben aviat a tots. Gràcies de nou, Agnes i Damian.
Thank you.